the next segment is under the topic of Rise to New Vistas, partnered by ITC. ITC is India's foremost private sector companies and a diversified conglomerate spanning across businesses. ITC's uncompromising commitment to the health and safety of its consumers ensures adherence to the highest levels of quality, safety, and hygiene standards in manufacturing processes in the supply chain. ITC has a vibrant portfolio with world-class brands delighting over 250 million households in India. And now, with this, we'll start the Rise to Vista segment. I welcome on stage the first team that has authored the paper titled Double Jeopardy, Deciphering Cognitive Biases Among Doctors Through ChatGPT.
So, good afternoon, everyone. I know it's an odd thing to say it's coming from a Gen X person because we all talked about Gen Z, we talked about millennials, etc. So this is the way we see AI, the Gen X person talking to you. So and of course I first read about ChatGPT from newspaper. So for us it's pen and paper first, so not digital first in that extent. So therefore obviously there was a lot of buzz surrounding ChatGPT and everybody's using it from school students to CEOs from leave letters to love letters everywhere. So there is ChatGPT everywhere. So we also wanted to see. We had this classical Hamlet thing. To do or not to do. So we wanted to go with see how this thing works. It's a simple play that we did with the ChatGPT and see how things work. So we wanted to give the most challenging problem that we kind of felt we could do. One, medical decisions. The other, cognitive biases. Two really challenging problems, and to see how ChatGPT fares there. So obviously, why medical decisions? Because it takes 5 and 6 years of education. Beyond that, obviously, you need pretty much your entire lifetime in terms of an earned skill, in terms of understanding what how to go about treating patients, how to take decisions, etc. Of course, even cognitive biases, it's a higher order expertise. You have Nobel laureates being the people who are talking about it. So obviously, cognitive biases, there are a lot of angles to it. It's not just everything is bad about cognitive biases. Expert intuition also has an advantage. So in that sense, and obviously, it's very difficult to do these kind of studies, because of patient confidentiality. There's a patient privilege to it, and all of that. So how do we even start? So we really had to kind of think about how we have to go about it. So we kind of looked at an approach. One, we wanted to kind of look at studies which were done, where doctors' cognitive biases were discussed at length, where we could find such data. And we also had to look at studies which had raw data, where we could get patient cases, so we could compare and contrast, and use ChatGPT to kind of look at similar data and compare and contrast with that, and see how things work, and also assess the performance of ChatGPT in terms of how do I kind of compare a ChatGPT outputs vis-a-vis an expert outputs. So the classical test which any market researcher does, a test vis-a-vis control. For us, the control is how an expert does it. The test is how ChatGPT delivers those findings, and see how well a ChatGPT can deliver as compared to an expert. So this is how the experts went about it. So among experts, among doctors themselves, they chose a first among equals. They looked at few among them who understand decision-making process, who kind of understood how things go. So they kind of looked at a framework. They looked at 17 biases. In fact, they had 7 case studies. In those 7 case studies, they had 17 biases, and they kind of coded those 17 biases in terms of highly likely, probable, and not likely. So this is how the experts went about it. And this is how they labeled those biases themselves. Because, of course, every bias, availability or anchoring or confirmation, it kind of changes the context in terms of every category and all of that. So within them, so they arrived upon a common understanding of how those biases have to be labeled. So in terms of those findings, what we came across, first a bit of qualitative assessment. This is the case study. So I will not get into the details, but broadly, this is how the case study looked. An ischemic heart condition, a patient came there, and we gave those queries. The way we kind of presented the query in the ChatGPT platform is, now this is the case study, analyze this, and there are 17 odd biases. Please choose probable, highly likely, and not likely among those 17 biases. So we forced the ChatGPT platform to kind of code these biases, identify and code the biases in this case study. So this is what ChatGPT came with. Initially, let's look at a qualitative assessment. So initially, the experts called out availability bias. ChatGPT also called out availability bias and also gave a very similar reasoning as to how it kind of came across that conclusion, because the fact that the patient had gone to Italy and therefore the very fact that he could have had COVID in fact came readily to their mind, so it came through. So in fact, if you look at even the articulation, it was very similar. So this is one. So the other bias, which in fact the experts as well as ChatGPT agreed upon, is confirmation bias. Even there, one could see there is a similar level of agreement between a ChatGPT as well as experts here. So this is a very, very qualitative assessment for one particular case study. So we wanted to kind of press it further and see, can we add a bit more mathematical dimension to it. So what we had here is we had 7 case studies, we had 17 biases, and we also had 3 possibilities, either highly likely, not likely, and probable. So what we did was, since we forced the platform to kind of commit to a particular code, either choose among highly likely, probable, or not likely. So what we kind of did is we kind of gave a certain level of scoring, to that. Like for instance, if it attempts, ChatGPT attempts to give a code and does it incorrectly, we gave a certain score to it. If it makes an attempt and identifies the bias incorrectly for a certain level, like one level below the expert, so we gave a certain level of accuracy to it. Similarly, if it attempts and identifies the bias correctly, then we gave it 100% kind of a score. Similarly, if it chooses not to attempt and then did not probably doesn't get it, or probably scores one level below, we gave another score. So what happens is we gave a gradation in terms of score basis on the attempt. So we kind of looked at attempt as a learning effect made by the platform and kind of decided that we should give or award a particular thing to it. And of course, we kind of gave an intelligence index. So if you look at how the expert as well as ChatGPT fares across those 17 biases, in each of those cases, one could see, just in simple words, if I have to explain this chart, the green and the amber very clearly indicates, between the expert and the ChatGPT platform, there is a lot of similarity. So when we ran a bit of analysis and then saw how one can look at it, one could see a very good correlation between the learning effect as well as the intelligence index. So one could clearly see that between this, and there is a good consistency in at least 3 or 4 prominent biases where the platform was able to kind of match the predictions that were made by ChatGPT. In fact, we could see some of those common biases, which is like availability bias, confirmation bias, or even anchoring. So these kind of biases, which are according to a lot of peer group studies, which is evident that these are the commonly occurring biases in the medical decision making, was something which even the ChatGPT was willing to take bets on. So that is something one could very clearly see. So as a closing thought, what we felt is these are the 4 principles which we picked from a book called Co-Intelligence. One, first thing that came to our mind, of course, we pick ideas from book, which still are Gen X. So one, always invite AI to the table, which made us look at this idea seriously. Second, be the human in the loop. So that's the reason why we kind of looked at not just a qualitative assessment, but also did a qualitative assessment in terms of how the learning and the effort as well as the the interpretation and the intelligence index came through. Third, treat AI like a person. So we kind of decided to award the platform to in terms of the effort it took to in terms of give the learning effect, or in terms of the 3 probabilities. The fourth is assume this is the worst AI will see, because the more you do, it's going to get better. So that's the 4th principle we kind of wanted to leave you with. So yeah, so we are done. So we are more than happy to take questions.
So there's a question. Given the complexity of medical terminology, what challenges did you encounter in training ChatGPT to interpret and analyze medical language, and how were these challenges addressed?
In fact, we did not see, personally, we didn't see any challenges because the case studies were quite common because we had access to those case studies. So when we compared, the only difference that we could see is the granularity with the experts was slightly better, and the level of detailing was far deeper when it comes to experts. But at least the top biases, as one could see, the availability, confirmation, all of that, which is quite predominant across categories, is something which the AI was able to pick as good as experts. probably the lesser known biases, it wasn't as good, is what something that one could see.